But I'm not entirely sure what's we use 3 of those around 6 minutes. Like the opening ceremony of some description. Perhaps this is like existing artists.
I'm a queer fan of Ellen Thurlow.
Yes.
That's so good.
A significant follower of that.
I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, some setup on what we think these jurisdictions looks like and how we think artists are going to go about their boycott. Secondly, why we think it's immoral to profit off of the suffering of these queer this queer fan base. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about how you do just get genuine political change when these artists stop performing. So firstly, some setup. What jurisdictions do we think we would qualify as having low queer rights? We think it is predominantly countries that do criminalize criminalize being gay or trans or things like that. We would give examples of Florida taking away trans kids from their parents, or the UAE having, I believe, the death penalty for gay marriage, if you are found to be gay. But we don't think it includes countries who do have laws in place that allow things like gay marriage, but where it may just not be a little bit more socially conservative. We will point to things like Brazil, where it is perfectly legal to have gay marriage, but they do have like a large evangelist community, if not entirely accepted. We think that would still be okay. The second thing to note is how we think these artists would go about the boycott. We think obviously they will no longer be performing in these regions, but we also think it would look like things like putting out statements explaining why they are no longer performing in these countries, why they've been left off the tour list. And we think in some cases having conditions such as we will not return until such law is passed or such law is abolished. So with that in mind, let's move on to the first question, why we think it's immoral to profit off of the suffering of these fans. The first thing, and hopefully quite simply to note, is that many of these artists have their platform largely because of their queer fan base. These are people who buy tickets, merchandise, records. They're people who promote these artists online. They are some of the most diehard fans. They do relate to this music sometimes the most. And so without queer fans, the profit and visibility of these artists would not be what it is today, and it would not allow them to have the very profitable tours that they do have. The next thing is just to step out how we think these artists interact with the government in these kind of countries. I'll give the example of the info side with Beyonce, where she was literally paid $20 million directly from the UAE government in order to perform there. Clearly, in some cases, these artists do just get enormous amounts of money from governments that are actively oppressing their queer citizens. But even if you don't have artists that are getting paid directly by these governments, we still think that in terms of booking venues, organizing security, negotiating with governments for things like being able to hold the concert until a certain time, and doing things like that around laws about noise levels and stuff like that, means that you do just have a huge amount of interaction with local and sometimes even state or federal governments. These are the same governments who are pursuing these actively anti-queer policies. The impact of this is enormous because you're essentially colluding with the government, oppressing your fan base to maximize the profit from these fans. We think it is immoral on those grounds alone, and we think, especially because the government can use the enormous amounts of revenue generated from these tours literally to make the kind of anti-queer laws that they have in place worse. But we also think it is often viewed by the fan base as collaborating with the government, and this is especially offensive to fans who are queer, who are part of the queer fan base of these artists. For those reasons, we think it is immoral for these artists to be profiting off the suffering of their fans and colluding with these governments in such a way, even if you do not believe they are getting the money exclusively from the government. But let's talk about perhaps the practical issue in this debate, where we genuinely are just able to get better political change. And we're able to do this in 3 ways. The first is increased awareness. Clearly these artists will be putting out statements and things like that. People are also pretty noticed pretty easily when their country is left off of a tour list. Many of these fans, and this has 2 impacts. Firstly, because many of these fans just are not informed about the kind of conditions of these countries in the first place. We can point to the example of how there have been a huge number of articles about why Taylor Swift is not coming to Brisbane in Australia, and the answer is just oh, she couldn't find a stadium to book. Clearly, if the reason she was not coming to Brisbane was because they had incredibly damaging anti-queer laws, that would be able to come up pretty easily. A lot of people are very curious as to why these artists don't book certain cities or jurisdictions to perform. But we also think that international fans of these artists have a huge sway, and they are just better informed when they discover that these artists are putting out these statements. Joe Biden, in the 2018 midterms, the Democratic Party almost won when Taylor Swift came out and endorsed Joe Biden in a jurisdiction that was traditionally incredibly Republican. These artists do just have a huge amount of following, and they're able to direct that in really effective ways. The impact of this is that you get huge attention. Firstly, it embarrasses the governments of these countries. They have very high-profile people who are putting out statements saying that you are doing something wrong and immoral. The next thing that happens is that you get less tourism and things like that, especially to these areas, especially when international fans do have more awareness of the fact of the reason of like the ways in which the government is oppressing these people. The third thing is that you do just get more political pressure. Fans are better able to mobilize. They're better able to do things such as put pressure on the government, especially international fans as well. We think those are hugely helpful. But we have two other ways we think you get genuine political change as well. The first is that you do just have incentives both for fans, but like who are incredibly invested in getting artists to these countries or jurisdictions so that they can actually see their artists perform, but also everyone who stands to profit from a concert being held in their city. People like airlines, people like hotels, people like pubs and restaurants and everywhere around there that profits enormously when you have an artist come to a specific region. We think they are also very likely to put huge political pressure on governments. Maybe that works through directly lobbying governments. Obviously massive airline chains and hotel chains and things like that do have a huge amount of political power and a huge amount of economic sway. We also think it could manifest in things like local governments putting out things like local ordinances or something like that, saying like for example, it's like saying that their city is like a safe space for queer people or something like that. Or it could just mean a change in the way that laws are enforced. In a lot of cases, there are laws that are like perhaps a little vague and like not directly targeting like queer people, but are used in a way such as like, for example, like public disturbances or something that are used in a way to target queer people. We think local governments often just can change the way in which these laws are enforced. It may, and get a huge amount of benefit that way. So even if you do not believe that we're able to influence state or federal governments, local governments that stand to lose the most profit from like losing these concert tours and not being able to generate the huge amount of economic revenue that they do, stand to lose the most, and they have genuine ability to make change by passing things like local ordinances, by changing the way laws are enforced, by negotiating with state and federal governments. We think you are just able to get a large amount of change there. But thirdly, there is just a huge amount of economic incentive for state and federal governments to attract these artists. Like Taylor Swift's Eras tour in America is like speculated to generate $1 billion for the American economy. You do things like fans needing to book flights, fans needing to book hotels, people congregating at restaurants before or after the tour, purchasing food and drinks before or after the tour, buying the tickets, having to organize security, having to organize like a team of lighting and equipment professionals, everything like that. These are hugely important economic incentives for many of these areas. They do just need large international tours in order to have the same kind of scope of fans and attract the most people. Even if only one or two of these concerts even if you only miss out on one or two of these concerts, that is hundreds of millions of dollars that you are missing out on in potential revenue. That is very, very persuasive to state and federal governments who probably do not want people to be very angry with the fact, and like businesses and like people who now feel the effects of that loss of revenue, to be very angry with the fact that they do not have it because of the kinds of laws that are put in place. Firstly, it means that if these artists boycott and you do lose those hundreds of millions of dollars, you just have less money to enact the kind of anti-queer policies that many of these governments do enact. But it also means you have a huge amount of political pressure. You're likely to have people mobilize in the sense of more lobbying at state and federal levels. You're likely to have people vote in different ways when they feel the economic ramifications of not having these artists play. You're likely, even in countries that maybe do not have democratic elections, you're likely to have some level of instability where people feel the economic shock of not being able to have these artists perform. So at the end of the day, not only do we prove that it is fundamentally immoral for these artists to be profiting off of the suffering of their fans, but we also give you three distinct ways you are able to get genuine political change in these jurisdictions, which is just the most important impact in this debate. That's why I'm proud to affirm.
Excellent. Thanks for the speech. About our first native speaker.
three things in this speech. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, the quickest point ever on artists, essentially, and specific artists that we think are harmed by this. And then finally, the bulk of the debate on fans and queer individuals in these countries, which will be responsive to what you heard from First Affirmative. Firstly, on setup, two things to talk about here. What places are we talking about? And I would just point to the fact that the distinction that First Affirmative draws is quite unintuitive, as in Texas is yes, but Brazil is no. Well, living in, I feel like a lot of queer individuals would choose to live in Texas, a place where there is relatively easy access to things like same-sex marriage, where sure, elements of legislation are poor, but others aren't. I would just suggest that this suggests how difficult this is to apply and assess, and the fact that, again, they would stand for not going to areas that don't have legislation for same-sex marriage, or, for example, Texas, a country, again, that has relatively strong, a state that has relatively strong anti-discrimination law, where things like violence is illegal against queer individuals, where also in major cities there is a relatively progressive social attitude, and the reason it continuously at a state level votes Republican is because of the way voting lines are drawn, even though major cities like Houston continue to vote Democrat. Just suggests that the bar that they're talking about is quite high, and that means that I think a vast majority of the developing world is locked out of by artists. Most of Asia, including places like Japan and South Korea, that do not have same-sex marriage legality. A lot of Eastern Europe, again, which has incredibly discriminatory laws to queer individuals, just would not be able to be toured by artists. That means it is a vast majority of the world that we're talking about. You're very much limiting the areas that these people can go. Let's then talk about the second piece of setup, why it is difficult to apply in the sense of who is an artist with a significant queer following. And I would point again to the artists in the information slide. People like Taylor Swift, or even someone like Lizzo, right, are just some of the biggest mainstream artists there are. They, have large audiences and kind of by merit of that have significant queer followings. Not the majority of their followings is queer. I think it is quite silly to suggest that someone like Taylor Swift, who is incredibly popular just generally, is, for example, like queer. And I would also point to the fact that, again, Beyonce and Taylor Swift are, straight women who often do not make explicitly queer music, and while people kind of adapt that and match that to themselves, it does not suggest that these people are, again, drawing lines here seems incredibly difficult, and to the extent you're ruling out, most big artists, particularly most, for example, female big artists or artists who have feminist messages that are often adopted, I think again, you're really restricting the places people can go. Awesome. Let's talk briefly about artists, and the thing just to say here is that there are a lot of queer artists and musicians, or straight artists who have been adopted by queer audiences who come from places that are restrictive. That looks like, for example, something like K-pop, which a lot of has a big queer fan base, or someone like Dolly Parton, who comes from quite restricted parts of the American South, not being able to perform where they come from and where they have connections and where they call their home. I think that's kind of cooked for these artists, kind of cooked for their communities as well, who lose a significant source of pride and are not able to celebrate that individual. And I think that's just an immediate benefit beside negative that should weigh into the debate to the extent that fans, I think we will win quite clearly, but is slightly more messy. Let's talk then about fans and queer individuals in these countries. At the start of this, and I think this is agreed on by First Affirmative somewhat implicitly, is that while in the West you often have things like census data suggesting that a greater proportion of populations identify as queer, there is obviously a massive amount of queer individuals in the developing world or in places with restrictive laws. And the reason for that is very simply that things like census data or legislation don't track very well what people actually identify with. Because to the extent you live somewhere that is undemocratic or that has repressive social norms, you are less likely to feel comfortable, for example, filling in the census or voting in your interests, or may not have the option to do that, which just suggests that there is quite a large group of queer people in these areas that are obviously an incredibly vulnerable group, experience great amounts of oppression, and we should care about them a lot. Why should you care about this group? The first thing, I guess, just to flag, we've just talked about why you should care. Why is this group benefited? The first thing is just to suggest at kind of the beginning of this, these individuals are able to decide if going to these concerts is in their best interest, whether or not it's likely to be safe or unsafe, as well as the fact that artists themselves have the ability to do things like hire legal and security teams. As I suggest, they have a lot of negotiation power with governments, so there's likely to be safe events that people are able to go to. They're unlikely to experience things like harassment. Why then is it beneficial that we allow people to go? Many, many reasons. The first is the artists are often in these areas able to push boundaries, and again, that's because of what First Affirmative set up to you about how they have a great amount of power over governments in terms of negotiation. This looks like someone like Lady Gaga, who when she went to the Philippines was told by the government she should not and could not perform Judas, still doing that, because what was the Philippine government going to do? Throw her in jail? She
she is Lady Gaga. They have no real power over her in that regard. Or a lot of artists who go to these areas and wear, for example, a lot more revealing clothing, then would be kind of socially accepted in those areas. And by doing that, I would suggest that there is a benefit just in normalising that, to the extent that these individuals who a lot of people look up to and idolise, you know, regardless of whether they are queer or not in these countries, I think it is good that you have that level of representation that people otherwise may not be able to engage with as regularly. The second reason why I think this is good for like queer individuals is to the extent that there are large queer followings, going to these concerts and being able to access them means you're more likely to, you know, be able to access a queer space, to be surrounded by people who are potentially queer, which is, I think, quite high impact, particularly in the least friendly queer environments, where otherwise you don't have options to these sort of things. I think being able to go to a concert and hearing, you know, like songs that mean a lot to you, like live in that sense, is something that is very impactful, as well as the fact that like this obviously benefits the venues and spaces that are able to host these. They say that like the government is profiting off of this. I really don't think they are, maybe incredibly indirectly through like tax revenue. But as they identify, the main benefit is to businesses on the ground. And I would suggest that those aren't the major corporate businesses, aren't, you know, like major corporations that are benefiting. Those are the places where these artists choose to perform, which sometimes will be things like stadiums and arenas, but other times will be queer venues that they are like choosing to support to the extent that they exist and they're able to. And I think that that's really good for those individuals who even, you know, beyond queer people are able to benefit from increased like tourism and profit in those regions. Probably a good thing. That is also just to say that the concert is likely to be incredibly fun. Often people do save up for these. It can be a once in a lifetime experience, particularly to the extent you live in one of these regions. It's unlikely that someone you idolize, you know, comes particularly regularly. And I think the fact that people are able to go to relish in their identity is just a benefit and something that they otherwise would not have and that we should value quite a lot. The final thing to talk about here is about how artists are able to advocate and push for change, which is, I think, quite directly responsive to what they tell you about lobbying on their side. And I think that's just because they have a much greater ability to do this when they go to these regions. Why is that? The first is just to say that I think they develop you know, a more, like, I guess, personal connection with that experience to the extent that they talk to fans on the ground, something they're often likely to do, or see the conditions of that country, or, for example, do research into the countries they're going to and stuff like that. And that means that in the future, they're more likely, and I guess there as well, they're more likely to talk about that experience on things like interviews. They're more likely to do charity events. Often these things are themselves charity events, even if not directly for a queer cause, for a cause, you know, such as like fighting poverty or something like that, which obviously has like consequences for queer fans, but also for the country as a whole, which just means that they identify closer with it, are more likely to advocate for it in the future, but can also use this directly as an advocacy platform. The other way that they kind of, I guess, more implicitly advocate is through delegitimizing queerphobia quite directly, which is just to say that to the extent that they are there and someone that a vast majority of the country values, to the extent that they even, you know, like make comments or like speeches in support, or to the extent that it is just a joyful event that is somewhat associated with queer culture, that a lot of people do experience a really direct material benefit from. Note to the economic gain that this team talks about. That means that people realize that like this can be a good thing, and a lot of the negative social like norms that they like suggest, things that suggest that queer events are really socially degrading and stuff like that, just kind of are displaced because you recognize that actually it's in your self-interest to host these kinds of events. And so you're more likely to support things like pride events in the future and stuff like that because you view it as directly tied to your own self-interest. The alternative as well, I would just flag, is the villainization of these individuals to some level. That is to say, you're probably quite pissed off if someone will not come to your country for something that you view is not your support. And so by them coming, you're more likely to listen to them when they say things that are in support of these individuals. That just suggests that you're able to get more advocacy, you're able to allow queer fans to have a lot of fun in these countries, something we should support.
Excellent, and thanks for the speech and about this second affirmative.
begin by observing how incredibly low impact this negative team's case is. Maybe it's true if you're one in a million Taylor Swift fans that actually gets to attend a concert. You might feel somewhat validated when she sings a song about queer rights. But for the vast majority of fans, it is this artist denying to go to your country, which is the exact thing which gets your government involved. It is the exact thing that gets international scrutiny on these countries. You get far more attention under our side. If all it takes for Marsha Blackburn, a Tennessee Republican, to almost lose a midterm she was guaranteed to win, is Taylor Swift posting a photo with some blue cupcakes and a political caption. Like, this team gets literally no engagement. We get a huge amount. We do far more for queer rights. Their case is incredibly low impact. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, on the impact of fans, and secondly, on the impact on queer rights, because we just are able to achieve far more than this opposition ever could. Firstly, on the impact of fans, their main push here is that fans feel incredibly kind of excluded and that it is a net loss to them when they are unable to attend these concerts. The first thing I want to observe here is this is an incredibly low impact claim for the reason that the average fan just cannot attend a concert anyway. Often these artists have extremely high ticket prices. They're unable to physically seat that many people in a stadium, right? Like, most Taylor Swift and Beyonce fans will experience the Eras tour and the Renaissance tour via TikTok video, right? Like, I just think it's untrue that the vast majority of fans are able to access this benefit in the first place. The second thing to say is I think overwhelmingly queer fans of these artists are the most likely to have bad experiences at these concerts, which is to say that there are so many instances of Lady Gaga fans, for example, being harassed. This notably happened in the Philippines, where they want to talk about her playing Judas when the government was against her doing that. Like, often there is just an incredible amount of harassment for doing things like dressing in a particularly queer way or supporting artists who have particularly queer messages. What that means is that these queer fans that attend these concerts, I don't think access the same kinds of benefits that this opposition wants to claim they do. But the third thing is, I just think it is on net better for fans and that they feel more validated and more seen when an artist acknowledges how bad the situation in their country is and refuses to go as a result. Like, if you are a queer Taylor Swift fan and Taylor Swift is refusing to go to Texas, for example, because of anti-trans laws, I think that validates you immensely. I think that shows that she actually cares about that. I think that creates an incentive for people to pressure and change the government that is more than you could ever get from listening to her sing about one song that has one line which supports gay people. Also, the final thing to note is, notice how incredibly low impact this claim is of, you don't get to experience your favorite artist versus you have the potential for immense and significant change. Notably, I think they can see that these artists do have the potential to engage in significant change when they point to things like their capacity to lobby governments by performing there. We would tell you comparatively that when you don't perform there, when you refuse to go, when you withhold immense economic benefits, and I'll explain why they are significant, you just increase the amount that you're able to do in a very substantial way. I think the better iteration of this claim that they make is that now artists are likely to exclude a lot of international cities because they don't fall under kind of queer rights laws, and they suggest that it's maybe difficult to apply and kind of access this metric. The first thing to say is, regardless of whether or not we go hard or soft line, or where this kind of line is arbitrarily drawn, we are still able to access all of our benefits. I think it's largely irrelevant to the debate if you believe any of our pressuring mechanisms. But the second thing to say is, obviously these artists actually just can't perform in a lot of places internationally anyway. They have to make trade-offs all the time about which places they're going to stop and which places they're going to go. And that looks like excluding a lot of cities where they would feasibly be able to perform, but they just can't because they don't have the time to go everywhere. What that means is, in our world, they make that trade-off based on which country in the region has the best queer rights, the best kind of access for their fans, which means they're still performing somewhere locally in the region. Maybe now, instead of performing only in 2 Southeast Asian countries, you switch which 2 they are to have slightly better queer rights. And that's on net a benefit for your fans. On net, they are safer. Different fans are now able to experience those concerts than what traditionally have been. What that means is now actually we access more fans because you're performing in fundamentally different cities. I think that's actually a huge benefit to fans in these areas. And also just on their push that not that many fans are queer, so therefore a lot of non-queer fans miss out in quite a bad way. The first thing to say is, I think definitionally in the motion they have to be in order for them to have a significant queer following. But the second thing to say is, this debate is not just about artists like Beyonce or Harry Styles or Taylor Swift. It's also about artists that have come out as queer and are likely to be persecuted or harmed by these governments. So it's artists like Lil Nas X, for example, who actively put themselves and their fans at risk by having these kinds of concerts. So on the material on fans, not only is their case super low impact and affects a minimal amount of people, but we affect more fans and different fans. And thirdly, we validate them and empower things that are important to them in a far more meaningful way than they ever could. Secondly then, on why we get better outcomes for things like queer rights, their suggestion essentially is that artists have negotiating power, so they're likely to do good things when they go to these countries, for example, perform songs that the government might be against. The first thing to note is obviously the concession that they make in this speech, which is that these artists do have a huge amount of negotiating power with the government. Obviously that increases when they remove the leveraging they have, which is to say, when you refuse to perform somewhere economically, when you refuse to give attention to that city, you have a huge amount of leverage over that government. And that is an important economic harm. They say it's not that economically profitable. We say obviously it is, right? Like you have to buy out the stadium to be able to use it for a certain amount of time. A lot of countries have things like laws, like so if you go, a lot of countries have laws, that's just a stupid claim. Obviously countries have laws, but like if you go past playing a certain time, for example, you end up paying like thousands of dollars per minute, like Calvin Harris did at Coachella. You just are paying these local governments a huge amount of money. The second way you get an economic impact is in employment, right? You have to employ more people to do things like have security, to do things like run merchandise booths. Those people have to like be from your local kind of area in order to substantially kind of have this function properly. The third thing to say is things like hotels, restaurants, flights. And New Zealand doubled their prices once Taylor Swift announced she wasn't going to New Zealand and was only doing Sydney and Melbourne. If you want to fly from New Zealand to Sydney and Melbourne, you're paying double the rate. Like that is just a boost somewhat to the New Zealand economy. Like when that happens like globally, I do just think that there is an economic impact. But notably, we tell you quite clearly in Arwyn's speech, and I think someone unresponded to, that this most benefits local government areas and councils that you have to negotiate with to be able to do things like rent out the stadiums that are in their local areas, to be able to do things like organize like travel arrangements, like block out public transport routes, etc., etc. What that means is the people who are most on the ground interacting with these fans are the people that you're most able to engage with. You're able to do things like have a moratorium on police officers maybe prosecuting certain kinds of things like gay people holding hands in the street, for example. You'll maybe have less funding to police officers that are able to be distributed, less funding for things like child services to remove trans kids. Like I just think it is economically bad for these countries to have these artists removed. But even if you don't believe it's economically bad, we still win on the messaging effect, which is to say that when a major artist refuses to go to your country because the standard of queer rights is so bad, that mobilizes the queer movement and gives them a degree of international credibility, which is really important, right? It reopens discussions about these kinds of issues. It means you're able to do things like get in headline media. It means you have more scrutiny on these governments. All of that enables you to protest more easily. Notably, if their claim is fans will become upset and disgruntled, surely those fans that are upset and that are particularly like harmed by their artists not going are now more likely to do things like support the queer movement. That means that they might vote a little bit differently. It means that they might, for example, donate to support a queer protest movement. And when you have like millions of fans that are doing that, that does significantly benefit these movements in a really, really important way. They say, well, maybe fans will do research or charity events, or artists will do charity events when going into these countries. Notice firstly, this is not currently in their incentives. Notice secondly, that you get completely drowned out in the media for the reason that all the attention becomes about the concert itself instead of about queer rights. We get that unique focus that they do not get. But the third thing to say is, if by their own analysis, the vast majority of these fans are not queer, why on earth would they be researching queer rights or supporting these movements in these areas? We give all fans an incentive to care about queer rights. They do not. Their impact is marginal and minimal. We help a lot of people, a lot of fans in a far more meaningful way. Proud to propose.
Excellent, and thanks for the speech, and invite up the second native speaker.
Three questions, first on political reform, second on benefits to fans, and if I have time then briefly on that principle of complicity. Let's talk about the political reform question, because I think this team has an incredibly shallow conception of how it is that queerphobic societies actually reform. And if you really subject their mechanisms to scrutiny, they fall down in a heap. So let's talk, I guess, about their two major ones. The first is that you have enough money as a prominent artist to bring local governments to their knees, which has a couple of problems. The first is this argument systematically conflates the economy of countries with money that the governments have access to and government revenue, which is to say, their mechanisms rely on you going to a gay bar, you buying a hotel, you purchasing a flight. All of these things benefit those corporations or those local venues, but they don't necessarily provide money to the government, which they can somehow enforce and implement queer-phobic policies. But I would say disproportionately the venues that we're helping, the ones that you're economically denying the benefit that they are suggesting, are ones that are queer-safe venues, where queer fans who might be traveling to that country might want to go, or where queer fans of a particular queer artist would go, given the safety and numbers of that kind of concert. It seems to me that those venues are the ones that are the most worthy of the economic injection that a big concert brings, and it seems to me that they have not sufficiently entertained that idea. But additionally, I think the bigger problem with this argument is it undercooks the comparative very fatally, because yes, it may be true that the UAE government wants to pay Beyonce to come, but they want like a famous artist from the West to come and inject money into their economy. It doesn't suggest that their second preference is that no one comes. It suggests just they would pay the same money to probably a straight dude band that isn't particularly affected by this motion. Blink-182, or Weezer, or Green Day, or Coldplay. Like, there are huge and super famous artists that don't have significant queer followings, which this motion would not touch, and for whom they would simply just replace the queer artists. That seems bad, because the venues that you're injecting capital into, therefore, are no longer more likely to be queer venues, and also entirely symmetricizes the economic harm that they presuppose generates political change in this debate. The second argument I guess they make is that you can generate political change through information, through endorsements, and through reducing tourism. The first thing observation I'd make about this is that it is relatively symmetric, which is to say, like, you can go there and do those things either way, right? Like, you can go to a country and release information. As we explained at Gypsy, like, often the artists we're talking about who are mega famous superstars, like Lady Gaga or Taylor Swift, are honestly protected from the scrutiny of those governments because of, as this team describes, the economic power they have when they come. So it seems to me they can talk about the kinds of things they wanted to without actually harming it. I think the Taylor Swift fact about her endorsement, like flipping a Republican state, notably the state isn't provided, is just a furphy. Like, it is just Sam trying to inject something into the chaos that is false. Thirdly, tourism goes down is actually not necessarily an awesome win for this team. Like, that seems to hurt the kinds of venues that they want, that we think are actually pretty important in this debate, like people in the developing world getting money from tourism. It seems like something that intuitively would fall into our arena of the debate. We suggest probably the amount of money is symmetric, but where that money is distributed is not. I guess even if you don't believe any of my responses here, just believe that's probably not the tipping point, right? Like, it is incredibly hard in queer-phobic societies to reform laws, to have local governments change ordinances where they were otherwise queer-phobic, because queerphobia is far more ingrained than this team is willing to countenance. It is religious, it is cultural, it is something that people tie up heavily with morality. It isn't the kind of thing that an economic shock would motivate a country to change. In fact, it may even motivate that government to wrap up its narratives against queer people and rally the backlash around the fact that a queer artist has said, no, we're not going to do this unless you have some Western morality. I think that has the high potential to be counterproductive. So believe at the end of this, there's absolutely no political change on their side, and it's very likely that they are stand to be counterproductive. There are fewer queer artists and less support for queer venues, but I think they failed to entertain our claim in this arena of the debate, which actually I think concretizes a complete win in this arena. First, we explain this delegitimizes queerphobia because it shows that queer spaces can be joyful, can exist, and can be entirely morally fine and economically productive, which is an actually incredibly powerful cultural motivator to show that queer people can live lives freely and not harm those nations. That actually is the thing that when people see it, it does change their mind. But additionally, going to a place allows you to use your profile to the greatest level possible, because you can draw attention to local charities. In fact, you can give donations to them of your profits when you go there. We think we actually win on their metric itself. Then let's talk about fans, because we get a swath of mitigation at second Affirmative, which just doesn't touch the impact at all. Let's deal with all four of them. First, there are fewer people who get to go to concerts. I think hundreds of thousands of people get to go to like a Taylor Swift concert. If tens of thousands of those are queer people, that is perfectly fine for us in this debate. That impact still lands, it is pure mitigation. The second is to suggest, well, they have a shit time at the concert, which I think is very speculative, right? It's just kind of like, oh, they might get targeted at the concert for reasons that go under-explained. We explain, I think, far more intuitively that these are often life-changing events for people who save up significant amounts of money to go, to see someone they idolize, to see someone they associate with part of themselves that they are constricted from expressing because they are in a queerphobic and oppressive government where they are unable to express those things, and they are uniquely able to access a queer space with lots of other queer people who are also fans of that artist when they go to that concert. In a way, that means that they probably won't have a bad time, or at least on net don't have a bad time. Thirdly, I think is this claim that you'd perform somewhere else in the region, like if you'd pick the most queer-friendly place in Asia, right? Which unfortunately, they have not yet resolved the definitional clash in this debate, which is like, they say Texas is, no, you can't go there. But of course, right, you'd go to Brazil. Like, come on, like clearly, if you ask an average Brazilian queer person, they would prefer to go to Texas. They need to actually resolve that question in third affirmative. I think though, it is in fact a very soft line, and it concedes the fact even fewer people would access those concerts. They probably would have to travel, and so would lock plenty of people out of that access, especially queer people who are most likely to be marginalized. It seems to me that that doesn't get them very well. And finally, I guess they suggest that this would put artists and fans at risk. I think we explained comprehensively at Gypsy why that's not the case, why artists themselves consent into picking the tour locations, why they have infinite safety available to them due to their superstardom, and why I think it's quite remote why fans themselves would be at risk. Like, why is it at risk to go to a Taylor Swift concert? I just don't understand why that is true. If you were a queer person who frequented queer venues, I just don't understand why going to a concert is the tipping point for you experiencing suffering in your country. You must then weigh our benefit, which I think massive. Firstly, it is certain. In fact, queer people do live in these countries. Quite a lot of them. They love these artists and they get a lot of joy out of going. This flourishes in the symmetry of the political change clash, and it explains it is the most concrete benefit for which either team can land. Secondly, it is morally important because the pressure valve of living in a queerphobic society in which you are unable to express that queerness is actually incredibly important to people being able to self-actualize. It is in fact potentially life-changing. And additionally, it creates a space for the free expression of queerness in these countries which otherwise would not exist if it was Weezer or Blink-182, because you develop the queer culture from those concerts and you make people's lives for the better for that reason. I didn't get to the principle. It is clearly defeated by all of that. For that reason, proud to negate.
I think the speech about the
I want you to imagine that this debate takes place in 1980s South Africa. Let's say there was a band that was deeply meaningful to a large swathe of black South Africans who lived under a system of oppression, who would get a lot of joy out of going to their concerts. It is obviously still the moral choice for those bands to not tour apartheid South Africa, because even to the extent that maybe that benefits some people who get to go to that concert, it comes at the cost of funding the governments who are doing the oppression in the first place. It comes at the cost of being perceived as betraying that community and selling out in order to maximize your revenue. That is the case we brought you inside Affirmative, which never receives a convincing response from the negative team. I'll start by dealing with three annoying quibbles they have. The first one is like, oh, it's unclear which artists these are, because, you know, queer people are, by like mathematical definition, the minority of fans. Obviously, like, just if the artist is mentioned in the wording of the motion, I'm pretty sure we can include them as part of the debate, or it kind of falls apart, fellas. Sorry, this is about Taylor Swift and Beyonce, and the other one whose name I can't remember. The second annoying quibble we get is like, well, it's kind of hard to draw the line. What, Texas versus Brazil? Does this exclude, like, how many countries is this excluding, or how many areas is this excluding? Like, I guess maybe it's true that it's hard to draw the line. Like, I guess queer rights are, like, pretty hard to determine objectively. That is true. But this is actually totally incidental to the debate, right? Our case has independent benefits regardless of the characterization. If you think it's just the hardline countries we avoid funding hardline governments. If it's softline anti-queer policies, we're also happy to not fund them. The economic incentives our case relies on are universal. The principle we explain is non-contingent and also applies fairly universally. It's unclear what the actual impact of that characterization challenge is. The third annoying quibble is that I lied about US politics and fed it to my two teammates. Fuck you, Tennessee 2018 gubernatorial election. Taylor Swift endorsed Phil Brendon, the Democrat, against Marsha Blackburn, the Republican. It had a notable effect on voter turnout and registration rates. I expect 4 minutes of your neg reply to deal with these specifically. All right, the two actual substantive questions in the debate are very simple. What happens when these concerts do happen, and what happens when they don't? When they do happen, there are three arguments this team makes. The first is that queer people in the developing world benefit from being able to go to these concerts. It's an incredibly meaningful experience for them. I want to note three specific pushbacks. Firstly, regarding their idea that it's safe for them to go, it's actually unclear how these people make rational judgments, because these concerts are often used as a honeypot by these authorities who are quite queerphobic. They do things like send police out to patrol gay beats. You can expect them to attract things like mob violence and harassment, like in the Philippines with Lady Gaga, as we told you about at second. It is actually really unclear why this is safe for these people and why many of them would be willing, often when they're still in the closet, for example, would be willing to go to these concerts if they are known to be a sort of hotspot of queer activity in a country that is otherwise deeply repressive, there's a deep cultural stigma around. But secondly, regarding the actual concerts themselves, I would firstly mitigate the vast majority of this. Yeah, a concert is meaningful, but you can still listen to this person's music, you can still engage in the fan base and get a huge deal of solidarity and community interactions and meaning elsewhere, which makes it really unclear what the unique benefit they offer is. But secondly, we would also just point out again at second that this kind of benefit of the concert is likely to be pretty exclusively accessed by the most privileged subsections of the queer community. That is because of the fact that often they are poorer or homeless due to things like stigma within their country. That is because of the fact that they get crowded out by the straight fans they characterize. That is because of things like the fact that Ticketmaster price gouges the hell out of these concerts, which means they are exclusively accessible by the economic elite, even within that queer community. So sure, there's a benefit to them, but it is very, very heavily mitigated, and that must be weighed against the impacts we bring you on Side Affirmative. That this is going to be perceived as a betrayal and an act of collusion with the government that is actively oppressing your community. It has to be weighed against the prospect of political change and the economic pressure that boycotts bring, which I'll get to in a minute. The second push they give then is about what these artists do. They interact with fans on the ground in these repressive countries, which means they're therefore more likely to talk about queer issues going forward and get political change that way. Firstly, they don't interact with fans on the ground of these tours. They have security, they're big top level megastars. They're not going into the mosh pit and asking what is it like to be gay in the Philippines? It's really unclear where this interaction comes from. But secondly, obviously they don't have an incentive to then go out and cause controversy and aggravate these governments for places they want to tour in the future. It's only thanks to the magic of fiat that we can make them do this boycott in the first place. Obviously their economic interest is not in fact to talk about queer issues and advocate for lobbying and change in these governments into the future. It is literally just the magic of fiat that enables that to happen. Sorry, fellas. The third push they give is though they now have the fact that you now can demonstrate queer joy and wonder in these countries is really good at pushing back against perceptions of queerphobia and the idea that they're all evil and going to hell and that sort of thing. And I just don't understand why. Taylor Swift may be popular among Taylor Swift fans, but she's not popular among the broader population of that country. She's not popular among the political elite of that country, who are not exactly going to suddenly reconsider all their beliefs about gay people, particularly if you believe Oscar's characterization of this as a religious or a cultural, a deep-set stigma, which means it's actually really unclear what their leverage for change is. What we explain is that our leverage for change comes not from the demonstration of these fans' queerness, but from their economic power, from the fact that they contribute to local economies when these concerts are occurring. That is what gets governments interested in responding to those incentives in particular. So, the actual benefit of these concerts is very, very marginal at best. What do you then have to weigh that against in the third question of what happens when these concerts do not happen? We give you two substantive arguments. The first is we get an independent benefit of more awareness and more discourse surrounding queer issues, because often these fans are low information, they're not particularly aware, which means they're more likely to do things like mobilise for political change domestically. They're less likely to travel internationally to these spaces when they are more aware of the issues facing queer people in those countries. But note that never really gets responded to. The second push that we get, though, is that there is a huge amount of material we give about the economic pressure it causes when artists refuse to travel to these countries. That is because often these areas are dependent on revenue brought in by concerts. And that leads to things like political pressure on governments because they have an incentive to respond to that, but also the fact that local governments and state governments have the capacity to reform things, doing things like using more discretion when prosecuting offences that queer people are charged with, passing local ordinances that, for instance, decriminalise gay, same-sex cohabitation, which is often illegal and in large parts of the world, and is sort of within their power to do. We get three responses to this in Oscar's speech. The first is, well, the government doesn't get any revenue, so what's the point? Firstly, thanks to the magic of taxes, the government does in fact indirectly get revenue from this. But secondly, we would note importantly, even if it's not the government who is directly economically affected, the businesses that they talk about vote, they lobby governments, the people who lose their jobs when those businesses do worse because there's fewer concerts also vote. There is obvious political pressure, there is obvious incentives, even in non-democratic states, to avoid economic instability in the perception that you've cooked the economy through your policies, which we explained back in setup, would be very clearly blamed thanks to the statements of these celebrities. The second response is that they'll just replace these queer-based artists with other artists. Firstly, we explained this back at Preemptive and Arwyn's speech about how even 1 or 2 concerts bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue, and that these are particularly large artists, like they are Taylor Swift and Beyonce. They have more star power than Weezer and Blink-182, which means there actually is a significant economic differential there. But secondly, we would note, importantly, these areas are often quite dependent on a reliable, ongoing stream, like they are set up to host concerts. Like bars around stadiums are explicitly there for the purpose of concerts. So even if a slight disruption to that schedule does have large consequences for the economy. The third response, though, is that it's really unlikely they're going to change because queerphobia is deeply culturally or religiously ingrained. We would suggest a more important religion for the majority of these governments, and particularly the political elites, who are often more educated and more secular, is the religion of the almighty dollar. They care significantly more about revenue and keeping their jobs as politicians than the average, than upholding a pure sort of like culturally pure country. But secondly, I would note that even if you believe they don't change, we also explained back at first that they have less money and less state capacity with which to enforce these anti-queer policies. They have fewer police officers they can hire because their tax revenue has fallen, because the businesses around them are unhappy. The only other material they have is that might make artists sad if they can't perform at home. We don't care. Grow up.
Great, thanks for the speech. Now I'd like to invite up the third native speaker.
To my knowledge, no large Western artists, whether they have queer audiences or straight audiences, in fact, no real Western cultural powers whatsoever, have recently gone or performed in any of the Central Asian states, like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. And I suspect if anyone asked them why that was the case, they would say because those countries are unsafe and one of them has legal slavery. And yet, strangely enough, politics in those places do not seem to have reformed despite this mass condemnation from Western cultural powers. And the problem for this negative or this affirmative side is that while what they are able to do is deprive people who care deeply about the cultural experience of going and seeing these music shows, like they're able to deprive them of that, but they're never able to explain why this actually is going to do anything meaningful in terms of political change. Think about the impacts here. We're talking about a small collection of artists no longer playing music shows for a relatively low proportion of the population in these types of countries that are fans of them. Population that probably skews queer already. It's probably already pretty maxed out on motivation to vote already. All you are doing at that point is cruelty. You are not achieving anything meaningful. Which is why Sam's analogy to South Africa does not land in this debate. Because the South African boycotts had far more power in that context. They were coupled with sanctions that were extensive upon the apartheid regime, which obviously have quite a bit of power. They were coupled with international condemnation from states. And they were not just boycotts from artists who happen to have disproportionately black audiences, which I guess would be the analog here. They were boycotts of all Western artists of any sort, Western sports teams of any sort, Western events of any sort, and other types of culture that could be deprived of that country. That is orders of magnitude drastically more powerful, drastically more coercive than anything that side affirmative can claim in this debate. And that level of power is what justified the harm that those boycotts did to the population in those countries. Because of course you could trade it off against the very clear and achievable political benefits that were empirically achieved. That is what justifies the cruelty in that context. But they are not able to justify the cruelty that they impose on the queer fans in the developing world, or indeed on the straight fans in the developing world, we should also care about, I think, quite a bit in this debate. Because if they cannot prove clear and significant political change, all they are doing is depriving people of something that is meaningful to them, which is, I think, just an act of cruelty. It is just an act of deprivation. Let's talk a little bit about why this is important to people and why that is debate winning for us. The first thing to say here is that we observe in Oscar's speech, and I think implicitly in Gypsy's as well, that these are artists that are enormously important to the queer experience, including for people in the developing world who are also queer. And that one of the things that matters a lot, I think, as part of the queer experience, or as part of being a queer person, especially in an oppressive regime, is having a sense of connection to an international culture that goes beyond barriers and also goes beyond the facts of queerphobia in your own country. The fact that you can can relate to and attend these concerts, the fact that you can imagine the fact that you have allies in the West as well, that you're part of a global movement and a global community that all sees these artists as important or that holds them in similar esteem. You're able to partake in a shared cultural experience. And I think that that does give people really meaningful and transformative forms of hopes. I think that for these people, this is often a once-in-a-lifetime chance. If you're a queer fan in the developing world, it's hard for you to access these concerts. They're expensive. You have to save. You often have to travel. And anything that reduces people's access to this is reducing people's access to something that is often something that they would likely describe as one of the most transformative experiences of their life, as one of the most joyful and blissful experiences of their life. And I think that you just have to think about the experiences that I'm sure many people in this room have had when they've gotten to see one of their favorite artists live and in concert. That is something you will remember and do remember often for decades after the fact. It's something that gives you an enormous amount of joy. And when that's coupled with the sense of having finally had a space that is liberatory for you, that is also safe, that a space that is relatively safer as compared to many others in your country for queer people and draws queer fans like you, where you're able to go with your queer friends and partake in that experience, that is something that is incredibly valuable to these people. And depriving them of that is, I think, an enormous harm in this debate, especially when side negative or side affirmative cannot prove a clear and concrete way in which they could change policies in the vast majority of these countries. The second thing to say here is that this is obviously something we identify is certain. We are clear on that. The only pushback we get is the idea that maybe this is somewhat unsafe. But these people live in the developing world, or they live in these individual countries. They are well equipped and most equipped to be able to make those trade-offs, to determine how they want to partake in queer culture and how they want to enjoy this. These are the people who have the absolute most experience about what local law enforcement looks like and how to evade it. And of course, artists have a strong incentive to be protective of those fans, to stop anything of controversial or damaging occurring, because it would damage their reputation, both within those countries and within the West. It would hurt their ability to play in many other similar places, which means that this is an incredibly rare and ephemeral opportunity, something that ought not be denied. And I think you should think about the harm that this does to people across the vast majority of the world who are now condemned to living in a desert of only like Weezer, I guess, because obviously straight male bands can still go and play with total impunity, and side affirmative is not able to touch them whatsoever. Which is why I think that you should, again, strongly weigh this as compared to the things that they talk about with political change. Because when they talk about things like, oh, well, this is an economic threat, one, they actually don't really clearly explain why this is beneficial. For instance, they themselves identify that Dubai is paying Western artists to come, which perhaps suggests that these concerts are not huge moneymakers if you have to pay people to come. That is kind of a strange claim. The second thing is that there are just huge numbers of alternatives. Like if we're talking about a venue that hosts Taylor Swift, that's not like a specialized venue. That's a fucking arena. Like you can host a sports game there instead. You can host many other cultural events there instead. And often the market to get access to the slots in those venues and those arenas is competitive, which means that there are many other artists who don't need to be incentivized to come by government who want to come, or there are sports games that can come, which is why this does not do actually really anything in terms of being a real economic threat, which is why, again, you should look to the fact that the world that affirmative side supports seems to look awfully similar to the status quo in many instances, and yet does not seem to have led to transformative political change. The second thing to say is that the kind of mechanisms that they give here are just strange ones. Like straight fans who are now deprived of being able to see Beyonce in the UAE. Does that mean that they are like so upset with somebody, like with that deprivation, that they are now going to change their attitudes that are deeply entrenched? The answer is no. And I would suggest that for straight fans in particular, they're far less likely to value the experience of going to these concerts because they are not linked to the cultural things that we describe in Oscars and in my speeches that make these particularly critical and important for queer people. Which means that for straight people, they'll just go and watch a different artist. But for queer people who are already maximally motivated to turn out and to vote and to advocate, all that's being done to them is deprivation. So it doesn't change anyone's attitudes at all. This is not the tipping point to get, people like Emiratis to all of a sudden support queer rights so that they can go and watch Beyonce live in the UAE. It does not make sense. This is the tipping point for absolutely no one. Compare that to the mechanisms that we give you instead. We explain that when you host these concerts, they provide benefit to smaller venues that are owned by individual human beings on the ground. And that's something that means that people who own businesses in the areas where these concerts take place are far more likely to have a positive association with events that are associated with queerness, which does, I think, generate something of a, cycle where people are more likely to do things like think that a pride march might be a really good thing for them because they'll benefit from it economically when people come and participate. And it starts with Lady Gaga bringing them lots of money, and it ends with, I think, something like a pride festival in 10 or 20 years. But this does start to change those opinions. It does start to demonstrate economic need for those people on the ground. It's a drop in the bucket for every other actor in this debate, but it does really matter for small business owners who are often relatively politically important as well. We win that group conclusively, and they're clearly the most important group. And I think we win them quite certainly and really get no real responses. We strengthen queer venues, which can act as spaces where people can organize and collectivize, because when sometimes some of these artists, noting that this isn't always about superstars, sometimes it might be about Girl in Red or other smaller queer artists as well, when they go and play in those smaller venues, that gives them money and revenue, cultural cachet, which means that they can be more of a space for people to collectivize, more of a space for people to advocate. At the end of the day, the most certain and important benefit here was that we got joy to people who are otherwise extraordinarily oppressed, otherwise extraordinarily locked out of queer culture. That should be weighed more highly than anything else in this debate.
Excellent. I thank speaker for their speech and invite up the negative reply speaker.
There is this enormous about face that happens at Third Affirmative where I think they realize they're going to lose the debate on the issues of political change and fan joy and the relative way up of those. And they go really hard on the principle, well, I'm sure you would not perform in 1980s South Africa, right? You should boycott immoral states regardless of the outcome. So let's explain, first of all, in this reply, why you cannot credit that as a win condition for the Affirmative team. The first observation I will make is that they never really resolve why the barrier is set as incredibly high as it is, and I think they never resolve the tension that it creates in this particular principle. So we observe that in order for you to not boycott it, it needs to be a state which has legal same-sex marriage and widespread social acceptance of queer people, which honestly is not much of the developed world. It's probably major cities in the developed world, probably only. And it's certainly not anywhere really in the developing world, other than maybe Israel, which maybe is a state worthy of a boycott. Clearly, I think it's morally distinct from apartheid South Africa in whether or not those kinds of states genuinely merit a boycott. But I think they don't complete the analysis required to make this principle stand, right? They actually should ask the question, is it immoral as an artist who might in themselves be African, who has a lot of black African fans, to go and perform in apartheid South Africa? And to that question we answer, no, it's probably not. It's clearly contingent on a practical way up of, can you actually change the scenario? Can you actually end apartheid? Or how much can you contribute to that? Versus how much how much joy can you contribute to the fans that you have? And I think that way up is actually the one that's at the heart of the debate, and it's where we clearly win. Let's start with political change, because what you ought to believe at the end of this debate is the Affirmative team's claims here are speculative and rely on very dubious tipping point analysis that ultimately ends up being counterproductive. Because the economic harm is one that is ultimately recuperated by the fact that non-queer artists will fill the hole. And the only response we receive to this suggestion is to say, well, Blink-182 is not as famous as Taylor Swift, which unfortunately is not a charitable response to the meaning of the claim, which is that there are non-straight artists which have the same superstardom as Taylor Swift and would be able to entirely fill the economic hole. But it's mostly there, not accruing to governments themselves. Yes, GST exists, holy shit. But that is not the majority of the money that is injected into economies. And we suggest that what actually happens is queer venues that people would otherwise frequent when they go to these concerts do have funding redistributed away from them when non-queer artists go. That politics claim is incredibly silly because it's very hard to change ingrained queerphobic cultures just as an artist without the support of government boycotts, without anything else other than your own political messaging. They say, well, the only reason you can even comment on this is because of the magic of fiat. Ever heard of the magic of counter fiat, brother? We have counter fiat to do my speech as well. I think it actually ends up being counterproductive for the reason that boycotts themselves can rally queerphobia, a claim I make in my speech which receives no response, because queer joy can happen and be seen and actually contribute to narratives changing about queer people, a claim Sam turns his nose up at, but for unclear reasons. The fact that this deprives queer cultures of something that actually provides them some vibrancy in these nations, which can contribute to a queer culture capable of reforming their own countries. I think they end up losing this question, but even if you believe it, it's still speculative. Our claim of fan joy is, by contrast, extremely certain and benefits morally important people. AF's strategy in this arena of the debate is entirely mitigation city, from Sam to Neva. It is just to say there are a few queer people who benefit because they pay high prices for these things, and they may have a bad time there. But like, if you totally believe that, like some queer fans have a bad time, not very many of them get to go. That's still, for us, thousands of fans on net who have a joyful experience that is life-changing for them. And they are reducing those people's access. Ultimately, we drag them kicking and screaming to our win here. I think even if you buy all their mitigation, our benefits still stand. The narrative you ought then to believe is the principle is clearly contingent on delivering outcomes not delivered in the best case, and counterproductive to queer political reform in the worst cases. And if nothing else, to break the uncertainty in this debate, you experience some queer joy as a fan, and that is incredibly worthwhile. Vote for team negating.
Great, I thank speaker for their speech, and now I invite up the affirmative reply to conclude the debate.
At the end of this debate, you can believe that going to a Taylor Swift concert is the most life-changing experience you will ever have. You should still award the affirmative the win. That's because we prove two claims very clearly, and we prove them all too well. The first is that we prove that there is a tipping point for change, which means that we get a significantly larger amount of reform and mobilisation than this opposition ever could. And the second thing that we prove is that fans benefit from our case and from this kind of mobilisation in a unique way, and we extend that claim to non-fans by explaining that queer people in these countries benefit far, far more than the small group of people that are able to attend these concerts. That means that these two claims, which uniquely enable us to access our benefits, are claims that this team cannot shake off. They uniquely mitigate them. I'm going to start this reply by explaining why four claims that they make extremely late in their case are just unimportant to this debate. The first claim that they make is that you need everybody kind of to boycott because these countries will just fill the void with other artists. This misses the material we give you from the start of the debate, which is that there is a unique pulling out mechanism in this debate, which is to say these artists release kind of things like statements as to why they're no longer touring in these countries, that there's a disruption to their normal international tour schedule that would happen, that this is a unique model that is enforced at a period in time, which means that there is a unique messaging effect we get from this. This means that their second claim, that countries like Tajikistan, for example, won't change because of this mechanism, falls out of this debate, because countries like Tajikistan were never going to have these artists or any major artists tour in them anyway. We get a unique mechanism by which these artists withdraw in ways that they otherwise would not have. That deals with the first two claims that they make. The third claim that they make is quite late in the reply speech, is that, well, maybe these countries don't make a lot of money because they have to pay artists to go to them. Logic check this claim. Obviously, you would only pay an artist to go to you if you were able to earn more. In Jordyn's speech. Sorry, Jordyn. If you're able to get more money back than what you are investing in them going in. Extremely unclear why this at all proves that it's not economically lucrative. And then finally, on the responses that they have to our principle, which again I think they deal with mainly in reply. This principle I think still stands in this debate for the reason that we prove clearly that you are funding these governments to do things which actively harm queer fans and actively harm queer people. That means even if you don't believe any of our other disincentive material, you should believe that enabling these economies is particularly bad. I think Sam explains quite conclusively why giving money to the local economy does actually support these governments, why it means that you're able to get more money in taxes, why it means that businesses vote differently. Also just logic check this claim, like why would you ever hold an international sporting event if it wasn't good for your economy and if your government couldn't get more money? Like extremely unclear why people economically investing in an area doesn't actually at all benefit those governments. Extremely unclear from this team. Okay. What do they then say on the first issue of how we get more mobilisation? They claim, well, artists are able to mobilise when they're uniquely in the country, they're able to create safe spaces for their fans. The first thing to observe here is, yes, it is mitigation that a small amount of fans are able to enable this, but this is effective and important mitigation because it explains to you that the amount of people we affect in the debate is far, far larger than the few people who are able to pay for a Taylor Swift or a Beyonce ticket and are able to access those benefits. The second thing to say is, we explain unique reasons why we change the incentives of people in this debate to do things far better, which is to say, firstly, we mobilise non-queer fans to start caring about these kinds of movements by giving them an incentive to support queer movements in these areas.
areas. Secondly, we generate a far greater amount of scrutiny, things like international scrutiny into these governments for doing these kinds of activities. And the third thing that we explain in my speech is that media attention is uniquely focused on these queer issues, and that when you do things like hold a concert, there are other things that are able to be reported on that divides the attention, that divides the media landscape. You should believe that this is all far more impactful, that these are concrete structural reasons as to why we get more change. The claim that you can create safe, queer spaces for one day where a concert happens, I think is extremely marginal in this debate. But the second thing I want to observe is I'm extremely unclear about how large these queer spaces are in these countries that are so deeply entrenchedly like anti-queer and homophobic. Like extremely unclear why this actually substantially improves those businesses and why they function in these countries anyway. So at the end of this debate, not only do we get far more mobilization, and not only do we align the economic and profit incentives of these countries with the queer movement, but we also just impact more people in a more meaningful way than they do at one day at a concert. Proud to propose.
Great. I speak their speech. Thanks everyone for the great debate. This across the board.
I'm so sorry, Jordyn. I thought we
That's
saved it.
absolutely okay.